Hi. First of all, I want to take a moment to thank everybody who answered the question, is music fiction? And especially those of you who replied to other people's answers and kept the discussion moving. Sometimes questions that verge on meaninglessness can yield the most meaningful answers, and we got a ton of them. I'm going to talk about this for a couple minutes at the top here, but if you'd like to jump forward to some patching, check the description for the timestamp. So I attempted to synthesize a few themes from the various discussions of music as fiction. First, fiction and non-fiction as a function of truth versus lies. One thing I personally love about fiction is that even if it is made up, it can also be true. I think this may be one of the things I love about music as well. Synthesis as fiction, in the sense of imitation of previously existing instruments and sounds. This aspect of how synthesizers are viewed has probably faded a lot in the 60-ish years since they were first invented, but I think it is still with us in some ways. Even if we're not striving for accuracy or feasibility in imitation of specific sounds, we use knowledge of their characteristics and function in our sound design. Percussion, leads, bass lines, pads, sound effects. They all have roots in existing musics and instruments, even when the synthesized versions sound more like themselves. We have the opportunity to purposefully unmoor ourselves from these categories, even as we know that the categories function well for a reason. Here's an interesting one that I may not agree with, but I think is worth mentioning. All music already exists, or put a different way, there's a finite number of possible songs, and we may thereby be encountering them rather than creating them. This makes me think of Plato's theory of forms, of all human knowledge being memory, and also of mind-body dualism, which we can see too in Cinematics' comment that, quote, perception and reality are two completely different things. In the time before I was born, I had no faculty of perception, and I only became aware of something we could identify as reality once I began to perceive my environment. I'd have to say I think the two are intertwined at the very least. Fiction and non-fiction alike as storytelling. Now, I've often bristled at the old cliche that a good piece of music always tells a story, but I think that my distaste for that axiom is largely due to the way it wants to impose rules about structure. Many known musical forms follow some metaphorical version of the hero's journey arc, with an establishing theme, tension or conflict, and a conclusive return. That form itself has been proven to be effective in many cases, but I don't care for the idea of it being the only way for music to be good. But that said, I'm looking at this phrase differently now. A story can be about anything, true or untrue, interesting and exciting or not. I'd also add that while libraries will distribute any and all books into the categories of fiction and non-fiction, neither of those categories necessarily imply stories. Then we have fiction and non-fiction as real versus imaginary. This is similar to, but perhaps not exactly the same as, the truth versus lies dichotomy we talked about earlier. Music here may be inherently real because it does have physical form, but it may also require imagination in order to become real. Somebody says, music breaks the boundary between real and imaginary. In playing or creating music, we are making the imaginary into something real. Now, let's not forget to make a patch. We've talked in the past about phase relationships and phase shifting. Check out this clip from 2021, where we use a visual analogy to describe oscillators going in and out of phase with each other. We can create a similar effect on a screen with just a series of lines. Let's start with a white background and a series of black lines. Now let's bring in a second identical set of lines. Even just changing the size, we can start to see this shifting effect. Okay, now they're superimposed exactly, and let's start moving one of them from side to side. If we consider the distribution of these stripes to be their frequency, it's analogous to the frequency of an oscillator in a synthesizer. Two sets of stripes at the same frequency, shifting across one another, can be said to be going in and out of phase. If we set up two oscillators, say two sides of a DPO, to play at the same frequency and mix them together, we can create a similar effect. If we detune one very slightly, then they begin to go in and out of phase. In this case, when they're fully out of phase, the two oscillators actually cancel each other out. It's a little more fluid than the visual version we were looking at. Instead of obscuring each other, the oscillators sound like they're mixing in an almost liquid fashion. They sound, rather than two discrete tones, like one tone that is constantly changing. It's been a while since we tackled this topic specifically. I'm noticing particularly today how the phase relationship is something that exists between two elements. It's not inherent in the elements themselves. A lone oscillator cannot phase in this way. It requires a second oscillator, and the effect of that relationship is something different from the sum of its constituent parts. It is, you could say, making something imaginary into something real, spawning a new reality. Anyway, I was working the other day on a patch with several analog oscillators tuned together, and of course, the resulting phase drift, some version of which is so key to so many classic synthesizer sounds, was very pleasing to me. But then I started to think about, what if instead of monitoring these oscillators together, we use them as modulators for each other? There's a good chance that the periodic phase drifts will start to sonically stick out more than when they're simply summed. The places where they go out of phase may show up in sharper contrast, in other words. But don't take my word for it, let's patch it up. We'll start with a very simple patch, the spike wave from XPO patched into the QPOS and being filtered, monitoring it through the DXG. Now let's tune the STO to the same note. We'll patch its sine wave to the other DXG channel to tune it up. Now we could FM the XPO with this sine wave, but I'm thinking let's take another step back and use it to modulate the XPO's use as a modulator. Here's what I mean. We'll patch the left and right wave-folded outputs from the XPO to the radiate inputs of the QPOS. Turning up Q a little bit to hear the effect more deeply. As we adjust the timbre parameters of the XPO, we hear the effect not in the XPO's own outputs, but rather in the filters. The spike output, which we do hear directly, is unaffected by the modulate parameters. Now let's use the STO to modulate them. The fine-tuned control of the STO lets us choose the exact degree to which these two oscillators are out of tune with each other. Which means basically that it's controlling the tempo of the full phase shifts. The number of hertz the two VCOs are out of tune with each other will determine what fraction of a second the phase shifts occur. Once they get far enough out, it sounds like a noisy or constant timbre change. But when they're close, they seem to shift in a rhythmic fashion. I'd also note that because the modulate and radiate controls are in stereo, with individual offsets and attenuation, there's a resulting stereo motion to these rhythmic timbre shifts, which will best be heard if you're wearing headphones or monitoring in a quality stereo listening environment. very small differences in the position of the knobs can be kind of drastic here. Let's bring in a secondary modulator to add another layer of rhythmic timbre shift. I'm going to use this maths channel here. We'll start by patching it to the DXG just to get it in tune. Let's patch it to the attenuated frequency input of QPOS. This has the potential to be more extreme of a modulator. The phase shifts have a spiky, transient quality to them that reverses depending on whether the maths is lower or higher frequency than the oscillator. I believe this is because I've set it up to be more of a sawtooth wave shape, which is asymmetrical, unlike a sine wave. We can make a sort of sub rhythm by also adjusting the fine tune on STO. If it gets difficult to keep the maths in tune, which it probably will when such tiny variations make such a difference, we can optionally sync it to the XPO by patching the sawtooth to the trigger input. We can create yet another rhythmic element by feeding back a bit. Let's take the right bandpass output of the QPOS to the XPO's FM input. It's affected greatly by the frequency and Q controls. I'd add that the more different elements we add to this, the greater the effect is with small discrepancies in tune. It all becomes extremely touchy. It's pretty easy to get into many furry timbres, but if we want to shave it back to something smooth and harmonic, requires a gentle touch and close attention to the various relative frequencies. find that when I'm doing a patch like this, although the original tone of the oscillator remains present and audible, I eventually stop hearing it and start hearing only the various rhythms and alterations that are embellishing themselves upon it, like fiction imposing itself upon reality. Hello?
Walker, you've got to come check this out.
Thanks for watching. What's up, Allie?
You've got to check this out.
Is that Eugene?